All right, welcome everyone. So glad to have you all here who were able to join us live. I'm actually super impressed. You get like a big gold star for attending the attendance session in July. We weren't really sure whether anyone would be able to join us at this time, but really thrilled to have actually quite a few of you who were able to join. Thank you so much for giving the time. And what that tells me is that this topic, as we have seen in the last couple of years, is something that is really on people's minds. Our focus today is eliminating K through 12 chronic absenteeism, how to apply a multi-tiered system of support approach to address this really pressing issue. I know that we have been doing this work now at Safe and Civil Schools. We've been in existence as a company working with MTSS for behavior for about 50 years now, but our focus on attendance has really been the last 10 to 15 years. So it's exciting seeing that there's now more of a sense of urgency in the field with something that I think a lot of us have known for a long time as a critical issue, but maybe just not as much, as much policy focus and as much awareness of the things that we need to be doing to try and sort of move the needle on this pressing issue. So for those of you that I have not met before, my name is Jessica Sprick. I am one of the co-owners of Safe and Civil Schools, and I got my background, grew up in a family of educators. If you're familiar with Randy Sprick, big leader in the field of behavioral MTSS, that's my father. Marilyn Sprick in the world of evidence-based reading and literacy interventions and work. And I was a semi-self-contained special education teacher for students with significant emotional and behavioral needs. I also worked for a short period of time as a dean of students. And I think looking back on my time as a teacher and a dean, my biggest regret about that time is that I didn't know then what I know now about the importance of tackling attendance issues head on, and also the immense capacity that we have as educators to make a difference in what can sometimes feel like an intractable issue. So I have been the lead for over 10 years now in trying to think about how do we take what works with behavior, good behavioral change techniques, positive and proactive approaches, and multi-layered, multi-tiered systems, and basically taking attendance as a behavior. Let's treat it as such. And we know that we've got techniques that can help us create behavioral change. So let's apply those same principles and practices to how we think about attendance. Now, to get us started, I want to make sure that we're just all talking the same language. So one really critical principle that we have to think about is helping everybody understand the need to move beyond the metrics of truancy and average daily attendance as the only things that we're paying attention to. So, helping people understand that when we're focusing on truancy metrics, truancy court systems, truancy warning indicators, that's only capturing a small subset of our students who may have problems with absenteeism. So if you think about absenteeism issues as like a circle Venn diagram, truancy, which is students missing school without permission, is only a small slice of that. We have lots of students who are missing excessive amounts of school, but they're not getting flagged in a truancy system because they're primarily excused absences. So truancy, important warning indicator, but if it's all we're paying attention to, we are missing a lot of students, especially younger students, who may become truant later because they never developed the habit of attending when they were younger. Average daily attendance, the important thing to realize is it's an average. So I work with a lot of districts who are like, Jessica, our main overarching goal is 95% average daily attendance. And I'm like, great, interim goal. And they're like, what do you mean interim? What I mean by that is if your school hits 95% average daily attendance, you've got some kids who are pulling that average up. They're missing 0, 1, 2, 3 days of school, means you could still have a really significant proportion of your student population. And what our research tells us, somewhere between 7 to 15% of kids at a 95% average daily attendance rate are usually individually struggling with the metric that we're going to be talking about next, which is chronic absenteeism. So my guess is if I were to fly up a poll and ask you how many of you knew the term chronic absence 10 or 15 years ago, the percentage would be quite low. What percentage of you know it now? Probably quite high, because there's been a lot of national focus on this metric of chronic absenteeism. So let's take just a second to define it. Um, Chronic absenteeism is an individual student metric. So it's basically a way of saying that we're looking at, for each individual student, what is the threshold where we start to see a tipping point of high risk factors associated with any type of absenteeism. And what the research is telling us is that when a student is missing 10% or more of the school year, whether it's excused absence, truancy, unexcused absence, or suspension, that we see that kids are likely to struggle significantly. And that if lots of students are in this chronic absenteeism category, our system is likely to be struggling. Less academic growth for all of the students, struggles with culture and climate, and so on. So this is a very strong warning indicator. When we see that a kid, especially if it's a pattern that's developing across time, and like especially if it's multiple years that a student is chronically absent, we can start to predict that students and the system as a whole are really going to be struggling. So even as early as 2010, this metric of chronic absenteeism, which we can actually define, let's define it in terms of a number of days here. Let's see. Chronic absence, so 10% of days. This is 18 days in a typical 180-day school year. But an important piece of this work that we're doing is developing early warning indicators. So I don't want to wait until a kid has accrued 18 days. Some kids do that in 2 months, right? So we want to make sure that we're taking data regularly throughout the school year. Here is my first practical recommendation to all of you. Actually go through your school calendar and count up to day 20 of kid contact days. Mark a little warning flag in your calendar that on day 20, something is going to pop up and say, take your data and look for all of the students who have missed 2 or more days in your first 20 days of school. Right? Some of them are excused, some of them are unexcused. We're going to know for some kids, like this is a kid who we know got pneumonia at the start of the school year. And so like we know why it happened. We know they haven't had struggles with absenteeism in the past. We know that they're connected in school and they do well. It doesn't mean that every student that flags in those first 20 days is going to need intensive intervention, but there are going to be some kids that pop up where we're like, we either don't know why they were missing, or we need to do a little bit more deeper digging, or there are other warning indicators that are telling us intervene early, right? So I'm going to recommend day 20, day 40. Then if you want to keep going on a 20-day cycle, just 60, 80, and so on. But if you do day 20 and day 40, and you want to have a little bit longer waiting times between when you're looking at the data, then you can move it to basically 40-day cycles. Approximately every 2 months, we're going to pull the data. So we'll pull it again on day 80. Who are all of our kids who missed 8 or more days on the 80th day of school? Who are our kids who on day 120 have missed 12 or more days? And what we're basically trying to do is just make sure that we're keeping a strong pulse for all of our students. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor and they take your blood pressure. Each time we're just monitoring, how are they doing across the course of the year? And then how are they doing from year to year? The important takeaway here is any student who misses an average of 2 or more days per month is going to fall into this chronic absence category. Now, we know that there are going to be some students who miss, 5, 7 days, 9 days at a time. We are aware of those students. The hard part is when we have students who have what I call popcorn absences. They miss 2 days 1 month, they miss 1 day the next, they miss 3 days the next month, they miss 1 the next. And it's very easy that we don't really identify this pattern of absenteeism unless we are really taking the data and saying who is flagging when we're looking at that. We call it a red flag indicator. All right, now our next little bit of content that we're going to be talking about, this is just a summary of what some of the research says. A growing consensus of researchers, even as early as 2010, points to chronic absenteeism as one of the strongest but most overlooked indicators that a student is going to become disengaged, fall behind academically, fail courses, and eventually drop out of school. Now, I've been doing this since I think 2013 was when we really started turning our attention to this at Safe and Civil Schools. And what we can tell you is that since 2010, we have just had a growth of research, lots and lots of research pointing to exactly the same thing, that 10% threshold is really a point that we have to be very concerned about outcomes for kids. Now, as we start moving into some of the rationale and then some of the practical strategies for universal prevention and then tier 2 and tier 3 intervention, I want you to be thinking about this question here. you are the person, I am guessing, who has been tasked to come back to your building or come back to your district and hopefully kind of start lighting a fire behind people. What do we do to address chronic absenteeism? Well, one of the first things we have to do is we have to make a case for it, right? And especially with our staff members, we have to be able to sell them on why, with the 80,000 other priorities that you have going in your district and that our teachers have going on a day-to-day basis, why is this an important thing for us to invest some time, effort, and energy to address? So as we start going through some of these activities, I want you to think about that idea. How are we going to get people excited and engaged, not feeling like this is just one more thing being piled on their plate or one more thing that they're being told they have to do? We really want to get people invested in doing this work in partnership. So the 4 categories that I want you thinking about as we go through this next hour is rationale and strategies to help us work with our staff. Right? That's the number one thing. If you are worried that your staff are going to come in and like you're going to be telling them about some of the strategies that you're excited about and that the building is going to try and take on, you want to make sure that you do some pre-work to help them understand how is that going to make their life and their job easier and better? How is it going to make a difference for the students that they work with and care about? So be thinking about that rationale for your staff. The next category that I want you thinking about is students, because I need to have some strong rationale for my kids. Why am I telling them that they should be here every single day? Right? And so we want to be thinking about what are some of the arguments that are going to resonate with different nets of our students. You know, for some of them, it's the social aspects. For some, it's the academic aspects and the fact that they've got certain life goals. For some, it's going to be helping them develop habits that in whatever job they're interested in working in is going to help them advance up their job opportunities, right? Next category is families. And some of the same rationale that I might have with staff and with students might work with families. Some are going to be very different. So for example, I work in some places where a strong argument for their staff is if your state provides additional funding to your buildings based on average daily attendance, like, hey, everybody, if we were able to boost our ADA this year by 2 or 3%, here's what that represents in terms of dollars for services. I'm going to tell you that same argument you do not want to make. You don't even want to come close to it when you're talking to families, because then their perception is the only reason that you care is because my child represents dollar signs, right? So again, what are those different arguments that for different groups of people are going to be most powerful in helping them come into partnership with us in this work? And our last category is community. The groups that I have had the opportunity to work with that have seen the biggest lift in this work have done work across all 4 of these categories: staff, students, families, and also looping in community. So can we get our business organizations involved? Can we get our leaders of the community, whether that's religious and cultural leaders, whether that's our politicians, whether it's our fire department and police department, that we're all kind of working together to try and support our students. So again, these 4 categories, I'm going to strongly recommend write those down and make sure that as you're implementing, you're thinking about both rationale and strategies for these 4 different groups of very important players in this work. I know this question is going to come up, so I'm just going to address it right here. Per company policy, I can't give out my slide deck to all of you, so please feel free to take notes for yourself. This video is going to be posted. I am going to try and do just a little like summary key ideas notes document that we will send out to all of you who registered for this. It will also be available on the website after the session. And if there are any specific slides or like a small section that would be really helpful to you, let's say you're going to do some work with your staff, please feel free to email me. I will share my email at the end of the session, and I'd be happy to send you. I think I can send up to about like 10% of those slides. So, all right. So as you're thinking about this rationale for why is this important and how do we share this message, I'm going to share a little activity with you that I oftentimes will do with staff to get them thinking about this importance. So this is one of the activities that I've found for staff who may be feeling like, you know, this is not our biggest priority, can sometimes kind of break through some of that, like this is not as important as the academic or the behavioral things that we're working on. You have staff members on their own kind of create 3 columns. So what they're doing is they're brainstorming, what are the negative effects of absenteeism, especially kids missing 10% or more? How is that negatively impacting the student themselves, right? So I could share like some of our research. We know that there was a study in California where they looked at reading outcomes for students. So how well were students reading by the end of third grade? And they mapped it back to their kindergarten and first grade attendance. In this particular study, they found that for students who were attending regularly, I'll define that in a moment, 64% were reading proficiently by the end of third grade. But for kids that were chronically absent, missing 10% or more in kindergarten and first grade, only 17% were reading proficiently, right? So one argument I might have for our teachers of our youngest students is we know that this has major impacts on academic outcomes. Your kids are learning the critical, foundational, basic skills that they need. And I want you to think about how much easier it would be to teach and practice those skills if you had every single student with you every day that they weren't seriously ill or had a major family emergency, right? So negative impacts on the student inside and outside of school, negative impacts on the class as a whole. How is this impacting other students? How is it impacting the teacher? And negative impacts on parents, community, and society. So I'm not going to have us do this full activity just for purposes of time, but let's have everybody who is on the session right now pull up your chat box. And I'd like you to just select a couple of the negative impacts that you're really concerned about. I'll give you an example. I come from the special ed world. And so one of the big concerns that I have about chronic absenteeism is that it's really hard to parse out specific learning disability from students who missed a lot, especially if they missed in their early years. Scarlet, it slows the pace of the whole class. There is actually research that shows the more students are chronically absent in a class, the more the growth of the entire class slows down. Student safety outside of school, certainly. What are they doing? What are they experiencing when they're not with us? Susan mentioned connecting socially. This is another piece that I saw a lot in working in the middle school realm, is that, like, you know, the kids who are chronically absent, a lot of them don't want to be put in a partnership or a small group with them because they know they're going to have to catch them up all the time. You have students who, I saw this a lot with younger students, like, you know, kid has been absent and they come back to school and their friend group has kind of moved on. So now they're feeling disconnected socially. Makes it really hard to create that cohesive classroom community, cohesive school-wide community. Melissa mentioned lack of a sense of belongingness. So great. We're seeing lots of things in the chat box you all are identifying. And this is where sometimes with a staff that is like, why is this so important? Doing an activity like this can get people really thinking about how entrenched the issue of absenteeism is with all of the other things we're trying to accomplish, right? The message to staff, imagine how much easier behavioral, climate, and safety work would be, having a cohesive class community, creating a sense of belongingness. Imagine how much easier your academic goals would be if you weren't having to figure out some of the differentiation, and if you weren't having to spend your prep time trying to figure out how to catch students up for things that maybe they could have been at school for. So again, this is an example of an activity in a longer training. I actually typically have us take about 15 minutes to do some individual work, then some small group work, then some whole group share outs, because I do find that it builds some investment to move this work forward. That is going to be a critical component of this work, is how are you going to productively and positively engage your staff to do the ongoing work. Now, I'm going to make it a little bit harder before I make it easier. So we are going to talk a lot about strategies you can put in place to address chronic absenteeism. But it's important that you recognize that there are actually 3 categories of risk or success when we're talking about absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is students that are missing 10% or more. That would be like your flashing red lights, goodness, we are in crisis level of warning for a student. There's a middle category, which I would color code yellow. A student is in a yellow zone level of risk. It's like we call it at risk, which is students who are missing 5 to 10%. And it's not until students are in the category of regular attendance that we can be pretty sure their level of absenteeism isn't creating some of the negative effects that you all just mentioned and that we could brainstorm more deeply. So regular attendance, let's define it, is missing 5% or less in an academic year. Okay. Now, of course, we want students to be missing as little as possible. So if students can have perfect attendance or near perfect attendance. They're missing only 1, 2, or 3 days of school. That's going to be better than missing, 5%. But that tipping point threshold is if you work in a school that has 180 days in the year, students who are missing 9 days or less are in that category of regular attendance. So really, no more than an average of 1 day per month, right? Now, of course, we know there are going to be times where a student has a more significant illness that might keep them out of school for 3, 4, maybe 5 days. That means that our messaging should really be every single month that your kid can be here every single day. We need you to strive for that. It's just a way of trying to keep track of what that goal is, trying to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about what we're hoping to accomplish. So now, as we start shifting into strategies, what can we do to achieve the goal? First thing is we have to recognize the way that we've been approaching this is not getting us where we need to go. So please know if I am describing your current approach. I say this with absolutely no shame or shade because this is what I did when I was a dean of students. It's, but when you know better, you do better. Traditionally, the way that we have addressed absenteeism has been pretty reactive and punitive. Oftentimes the first time or the main time that kids and families hear that attendance is important is when they receive some sort of letter home at 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, oftentimes of unexcused absence. So we're also primarily focusing on truancy. And those letters, I usually describe it like this, and like if this sounds familiar, give me a little thumbs up. House Bill such and such states that, and then there's a bunch of legalese about why you have to comply attending school. And then if you're in a state that has truancy court, it references truancy procedures. I'm seeing a few of you emphatically head nodding. I'm seeing some thumbs up on the screen here. This is the most traditional common approach, right? But let's admit that it's not getting us where we need to go, right? If the first time that kids and families are hearing that attendance is important, it is, we've not taught what they should be doing, right? So we need to make sure that we're teaching the importance of this before we even see a pattern of absenteeism occurring. We also, truancy court, it can have its place, but I have worked all across this country and I hear some common threads. One is that, we threaten, and then we don't want to follow through because we recognize there might be inequitable practices or based on levels of poverty. It's not a system that's going to work. Another thread that I've heard is we have so many kids getting referred to truancy court that even if there were interventions that they wanted to try and put in place to support better attendance, it oftentimes ends up just becoming a fine or sometimes even risk of jail time for the families. So risks associated with truancy court. Suspension for excessive tardies and absences. I'm just going to kind of joke with this, that's almost like if I were caught drunk driving, my consequences, there's a keg of beer that's given to me. Doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense, but it is something that we see across the country is sometimes we are still suspending kids for excessive patterns of absenteeism, tardies, and so on. So we want to move away from those practices. I think what I want to prompt you all to think about is just that any attempts that we have to punish kids and families into better attendance have an equal and sometimes greater risk of pushing our families away and pushing our kids away from us. If we are relying on legalistic compliance-based arguments, for a lot of our kids, they may come in and they may put in the time, but out of fear of that fine or out of fear of that legalistic approach, but it doesn't make them want to be with us, right? So we want to be thinking about how do we shift the narrative, shift the approach. The reason that we're addressing this is because we want to empower our students to have doors of opportunity open, because we care about our kids and we miss them when they're gone. It's not about because the law says we should care, right? So I think that's a mindset shift for a lot of districts is trying to shift away from that reactive punitive mindset. So where we're going to is trying to apply this goal of a multi-tiered system of support approach to address attendance issues. The ultimate goal of any MTSS approach is that all students are receiving the supports and services that they need to reach whatever goal we're talking about. So if it's a behavioral MTSS lens, it's that all students are receiving the supports and the services that they need to exhibit respectful, responsible, highly engaged behavior, and that they experience a sense of belongingness. If it's academic MTSS, it's that all students are receiving the supports and the services that they need to meet the goals of effective reading or science or whatever it is that we're talking about academically. So in this case, our goal, all students are receiving the supports and the services that they need to be able to regularly attend every year so that they're not missing more than 5%. Now, just a little activity to illustrate kind of how we're reframing our thinking on this. And I know some of you are already well on this journey. Is we're going to consider a medical model. I don't know if all of you know this, but the MTSS triangle that I just showed actually did not originate in the field of education. It came from the public health sector. And it's the idea that we recognize for different types of medical issues, prevention is often better than trying to intervene. It's easier, it's cheaper, it's more effective for us to try and prevent a problem from happening in the first place. But also that then once we get to intervention, we have to have many layers of increasingly intensive intervention to address the severity or the complexity of the type of medical need. So to illustrate this, I'm going to have you take off your educator hat for a moment, pull up your chat box again. And if you weren't able to find that last time, if you look on your toolbar, you should see something that says chat. If you click on that, it'll pull it up. And we're going to, again, take off your educator hat for a minute and consider this question. If we had somebody who was potentially going to need bypass surgery for risk of heart attack, right? This is a very important tool that we have in our medical repertoire. But what I want you to think about is what do we do? And like you can take this individual accountability. What do you do to try and keep your heart healthy, to try and take care of yourself? What do doctors do to try and identify risk, to try and intervene at earlier stages rather than just waiting for everybody needs bypass surgery if they have heart risk? What does society do to try and prevent large numbers of people from needing this time and resource intensive type of procedure? So I'm already seeing some great things coming up in the chat box. Be proactive with exercise, low sodium, BP checks, quit smoking, education, knowing your family history, and also like doctors knowing your family history, proper eating habits, keep your stress low, keep them coming, okay? Sometimes I see that employers have insurance incentives or even like competitions to try and get people to engage in healthy practices. We've got sleep, we've got different types of medication, visiting your doctor for checkups, keep them coming. I've seen billboards from the American Heart Association promoting all of these different things. One that I find especially funny that I use as an example of this sometimes is like right before a major rest stop. Sometimes you see something promoting healthy eating from the American Heart Association. It's that idea you're about to go make some decisions. So let's give you some reminders. Limit your alcohol intake, proactive health screenings, free fitness facilities on campus. Let's increase access if there's a barrier. Excellent. Okay. So all of these things are basically the types of things that we want to be thinking about and getting creative with as we are thinking about our attendance initiative. There is a lot that we can do that is focused on prevention. So some of you might have seen where I was going with this. I view truancy court procedures kind of like bypass surgery. It's a tool, but it's late stage, it's risky, it's resource intensive, it doesn't work for everybody. Let's do a lot of other things in the interim and prior to needing to pull that lever to try and see if we can facilitate change. So a lot of the things that you all were mentioning were a focus on prevention, right? How do we educate people about the things that they can do to take care of their heart? When we talk about attendance, how do we educate people about the importance of attendance and strategies that they can use to try and boost their attendance? You all mentioned things like there were some, I really liked Melissa's, for use of fitness facilities on campus. That's basically saying that if we know that a barrier is the time and the access to the equipment, then let's try and remove that barrier by creating universal access, right? A similar type of example with absenteeism is in high poverty communities, and especially if you're working with students who experience homelessness. When students can't wash their clothes, that is a barrier to access to them them coming to school. If they don't have hygiene products that they need, they'd rather stay home than be made fun of for being stinky or for not having what they need for female products and things like that. How do we remove these barriers to access? So big focus on prevention. We're also going to think about with prevention, things like the insurance incentives, things like the little fun competitions, friendly competitions that people put in place to promote these different things. How do we apply that same type of thinking to motivating our students and our families to attend, sometimes even our staff members? I'm going to show you a staff attendance motivational system later on in our time together. And then focus on layered intervention and effective intervention, right? So if for person A with heart attack risk, it is, diet and exercise, that's a very different set of interventions than what we would try if it's a person who is really healthy with diet and exercise, but has excessive stress and doesn't have good stress management techniques, right? So effective intervention with absenteeism is function-based. For those of you, I saw we've got some school psychs and folks on our session where like I'm speaking their love language. But that idea that we're going to think about for kid A versus kid B versus kid C, if there are drastically different causes of absenteeism, kid A, it's a transportation issue. They don't have anyone with them in the morning to help them get ready. That's a very different intervention than kid B, who's not coming to school because they're academically behind and they're feeling frustrated and disempowered. So effective layered intervention. With our MTSS approach, our ultimate goal with this system is that we're not overwhelming our valuable interventionist resources, our counselors, our social workers, our behavior interventionists, folks that I would almost liken to like in our medical model, we're starting to get towards like specialists for different types of medical intervention. We're talking to the cardiologist, we're talking to the intensive therapeutic person who's going to be helping with certain, or our food and nutrition expert. And so what we're doing is we're aiming for, if we can create a strong enough system that we're basically, you can think about this like a filter. Can we catch 80 to 90% of our students with effective, universal, school-wide, class-wide approaches that are really focused on prevention? Okay, the universal tier one, I call building a culture of attendance. How do we make it such an important value, cultural value in our school that like if you were to walk up to some of the students and families and ask them what is important about being a Spencer Butte Raven, they would say, treating each other respectfully, making sure that you are being an important part of the team, and part of being part of the team is being there every day. Right? So again, how do we at that tier one level reinforce this so strongly that it really just is a part of the value system within our school? Then we're going to try and catch another 10 to 15% of our students with effective tier two interventions, which are targeted. They're a little bit more focused. So if we know that we've got a kid who isn't coming to school because they don't have a strong sense of belongingness and they feel like nobody really notices if they're gone, we're going to think about things like a mentoring intervention or getting the student in a meaningful work job where they have a really strong sense of purpose and a connection to some peers or adults who are like going to call the kid when they're absent and be like, hey buddy, we hope we see you tomorrow, so that the student knows that we notice and that we care. Or targeted, we know that the reason the student isn't coming is because they're feeling very frustrated academically. So we're going to try and get them into some things that give them a sense of competence and also look at some of those academic accommodations or remediation that might be needed. Now, of course, we're going to have some kids who have very intensive complex needs. If our system is functioning well, that should only be about 2 to 5% of our students that we're really digging into those more complex, intensive wraparound types of services. Now, ultimately, this triangle is all about matching the kids to the types of supports and services that they need so that we make sure no student falls through the cracks. Okay. Now, just one kind of more thought as we're looking at the triangle and as we start heading into the universal parts of this approach. MTSS, Randy, my dad, who really is one of the sort of pioneers of behavioral MTSS approaches, sort of facetiously says that your multi-tiered system of support is basically at the universal level. Let's try the easiest, cheapest thing first and hope you get lucky. Right? So when we're talking about universal systems and approaches, I've got kind of 3 main criterion for this. The first one is it shouldn't cost too much time. These are not resource intensive interventions. They should not be super time intensive for any person on our campus. they shouldn't cost too much money, right? So if we're looking for things where like, kids who have regular attendance are going to be in a raffle to get a PlayStation or something like that, that's not sustainable, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing things that don't cost too much time, don't cost too much money. Every once in a while, we can have some, raffles and different things where it might be more reinforcement based, but a lot of this is less focused on the reinforcement. It's more about the culture building. Can't cost too much time, can't cost too much money, should be hypothesized that it's going to impact a fairly significant proportion of our student population. Now, any universal approach that we put in place, it's not going to work for every kid. And that's not the goal, right? So as we're talking about these universal approaches, you're going to have to caution your staff, and I'm cautioning to you, try to resist the urge that as you start thinking about universal approaches, you go, well, that's not going to work for Johnny. And Johnny is our kid that has like the most complex, intensive intervention set that's going to be needed. It's probably not going to work for Johnny, right? But if it works for 10, 20, or 50% of the other students, and it doesn't cost too much time or cost too much money, it's worth investing a little bit of that work on prevention, okay? So Tier 1 proactive strategies, and I'm just trying to get a sense of where we're at with time here. Tier 1 proactive strategies, again, are school-wide, class-wide, and even district-wide types of approaches to try and prevent absenteeism problems from occurring in the first place. I have been doing this work long enough and with enough schools and districts. I am going to really, really strongly recommend, if you haven't done work here, this is very, very powerful work. Even if you have done some work here, keep thinking about how each year you can develop small additional layers to what you're already doing with educational approaches, with just sort of messaging and PR, with positive climate efforts that you're putting in place, and acknowledgement and recognition systems, because the universal approaches are very powerful when they're done right. So first example that I have here, if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, create a title or a slogan. Something simple, something catchy. Attendance Works, who is one of our great collaborator colleague organizations that's out there, Hetty Chang and her team, they're real pioneers in this work. They've done fantastic things for the field. Most of their free resources are branded with the slogan, "Attendance Matters," with an exclamation point, right? Super simple, easy to slap on billboards, stickers, buttons, posters, all sorts of things. Some of these other ones I like in conjunction with Attendance Matters because they give a target and a goal. So 9 days or less for school success, strive for 5. I had a group in Idaho who decided strive for 5 is a good one because we can emphasize strive for 5 days of attendance each week and try and have no more than 5 absences during the course of the year. A little bit more intensive than the 9 days. I worked with a group in Utah where they had less than 100 days and their slogan was "Be great, miss less than 8." And that was in hashtags for social media. It was on all of their attendance messaging. Like you went around this town in Utah and you would see, you walk into a coffee shop and there's a poster that has "Be great, miss less than 8." You walk into doctor's offices, there's pamphlets that are branded with "Be great, miss less than 8." So again, this is kind of like, I live in Oregon where we've struggled with forest fires. When I was a kid, I remember seeing Smokey the Bear and all of the advertising with Smokey the Bear. It had probably been 20 years since I had seen Smokey. And as soon as I saw the picture, I went, if any of you know it, you can kind of say it with me, even if you're muted, "Only you can prevent forest fires," right? Like we want our slogans to be like that, where it is just so commonly said, rehearsed, preached, that everybody knows it without missing a beat. Now, why do I have some watches listed here? Some groups that we've worked with have really tried to kick off very strongly at the beginning of the year. You want to think about whether you have time to put something like this in place prior to the start of the school year, or whether maybe you want to like launch a big campaign in January and use the time between the start of the school year and January to kind of build up to a big campaign. A lot of groups will do this with an attendance spirit week, and they've got lots of different activities related to attendance and different speakers and, swag and different things that can be earned during that week or raffled off. We've had some groups that have done this through an assembly combined with a community event. I actually had one group who tried to enlist a nearby NBA basketball team to come to their attendance assembly. They were not able to get the team to come, but the team offered, if you send us some little, one sentence things, we'll do clips of our players that get put into a video montage. I thought that was super cool. They played it at the assembly, but then what they also did, this is kind of the broader messaging and campaigning, they were able to get those clips put on local news stations and radio stations. So now we're broadening our reach with our kids and our families. So the watches. This was an elementary group that I worked with where they decided they would kick off their campaign with a fundraiser. So they sent out a letter to all of their families. They, enlisted help with their kids, did some little lessons on this. It was basically, we've learned that attendance is really important. Our goal is that every student arrives at school on time and has no more than 9 absences during the year. So that we can try and get all of our kids here on time, we are going to get an alarm clock for every single one of our students. We're going to teach them how to set and use that alarm clock, and we'd love your support with that. If you can send $2, that will fund your student's alarm clock. If you can send 10, you're funding yours and 4 others. If you can't, no problem. We will make sure that we fundraise. So they reached out to local business organizations. They reached out to community leaders to sort of share this messaging, and they were able to fundraise to be able to get all of their students' alarm clocks. Now, they looked at several different types. You can see some up on the screen. The ones they ended up going with were the wristband alarm clocks, which I believe they bought them in bulk for like $1.50. And then they were able to get their school mascot and their attendance slogan printed on the wristband for every kid. And every kid got to select which watch they wanted, right? So if you think about this from a universal perspective, not super time consuming. This costed a little bit more money, but because they did it as a fundraiser and they also reached out to business organizations, that's also messaging, right? It's teaching people what we're learning and about the importance. But if you think about this from the perspective of the kids, the school, a new kid comes onto this campus. They see all of the kids wearing these wristbands. They see all of them have the slogan, "Be great, miss less than 8," or whatever that slogan is. What does a kid immediately know is important in this school? Attendance, right? Coming on time. So this is all that part of that culture building that we're talking about. Let me give you 1 or 2 more examples of universal, and then we'll move into some of our intervention. This is a very simple strategy. If you have not done this already, consider it. Start with a proactive letter home to all of your families. Make some of the intro material that your teachers are going to teach to students. I'm going to read you this letter, and as I'm reading it to you, I want you to type into the chat box, like, what words and phrases come to mind? What is the tone of this letter? Really think about, how does this differ from a lot of the letters that we send home that are more the reactive, punitive ones, okay? Dear families, we're looking forward to a great year with students in class and ready to learn every day. We have learned that students who miss even a few days of school each month are at far greater risk of academic failure and dropout than students who attend regularly. We've set a goal that every student in our school attends regularly, has 9 or fewer absences in a year. Because attendance is so important, please send your child to school every day unless he or she has a contagious illness or is running a fever. We've included a chart. Let's see. We've included a chart with this letter that will help you keep track of your students' absences. If your child is at risk of missing too much school, please feel free to contact, and then it lists like counselor's name and number for assistance. We will also monitor each student's attendance across the year so we can work with families when the number of absences puts a student at risk. We will be happy to work with you to help your student attend regularly and have greater opportunities for success. So some of you are noticing it's got a tool. Some of you are noticing it's positive, it's proactive, it's visual. It is, not accusatory. It's really trying to say that we're doing this in partnership, right? So we're going to anticipate not every family is going to read the letter. We're going to anticipate not every family is going to use the chart, but a little bit of awareness and some tools and some assumption of positive intent. For a lot of our families, we can start shifting that approach. I really envisioned this is like, cardstock paper, if you want to get fancy, laminate it. I have now had lots and lots of districts that have turned this into a refrigerator magnet. First Creek was the first group that did this in Washington State. I kind of snorted coffee out of my nose when I read the upper statements on it. And then I realized like this probably wouldn't work in every school because it's a little bit snarky, but it's clear. A whole year has 365 days. A school year has only 181. That leaves 184 days for family time visits, holidays, shopping, household jobs, and other appointments, right? But I do love the clarity of their green, yellow, and red. I will make sure that I send out a sample of this to all of you in follow-up. I just wanted to show you a couple of other examples, and Kasha is actually here from Union County. Union County was one of the groups that turned this into a refrigerator magnet, and they combined two strategies, the letter in the refrigerator magnet with another strategy that we talk about in the Universal, which is a how sick is too sick checklist. Make sure that your families have something so that if they've got a kiddo who kind of like mine, I have an 11-year-old who, especially when she was younger, was a little bit psychosomatic about like if anybody was getting sick, she thought she was getting sick. So we had to have this checklist of does she have a fever of 100.4 degrees or more? Has she vomited 2 or more times in the last 24 hours? So this is another sample that I'll send out to you. The one on the left-hand side is one of the ones that we have in some of our published resources. The one on the right-hand side is the district that was Be Great, Miss Less Than 8. They designed kind of an infographic version of this. This is something that as you see that cold and flu season is starting to tick up, resending it to your families or sending home a laminated version so that they can make some of those decisions. These are all things that can start to move the needle. All right. We are very rapidly running out of time, so I just want to give you one more piece of universal food for thought. With school-wide and class-wide motivational approaches, I am going to strongly recommend that if you have year-long perfect attendance awards, start to move away from that. We don't actually want this from our kids, right? There are times when they are contagiously ill and like, please stay home, right? It's too long of a time period. It's too high stakes. As soon as a kid misses a day, they no longer have access to that thing. So if you are going to do perfect attendance, I would recommend do it monthly. And then like, you know, they can accumulate as many of those perfect attendance awards as they want. But even more importantly, we're going to focus on regular attendance. So who are our kids that in 3 months missed no more than 3 days? Who are our kids that by the end of the year missed no more than 9 days? And that's a accessible goal, right? We're also going to focus on improved attendance. So looking at individual students, it might not be a public award, but if we are doing any sorts of incentives and different things like that, if we have kids who, you know, last month we had a kid who missed 5 days and this month they missed 1 day or less, we should at the very least be acknowledging it. Right? So here's a very simple practice that I recommend with a lot of the groups that I work with behavior and with attendance is consider easy, simple ways that you can build in positive acknowledgement for your kids. These are pictures of my 2 kiddos when they were 1-year-old and 3 years old. In their daycare, every month or so, we would get a stack of little quarter slips of paper with a little stick figure with a smiley face on it and just a positive observation from a staff member. And we would get stacks of them. What was beautiful about it is it was such a minimal time investment from the staff. But for me as a parent, it was like, you see my child. Right? So I want you to think about how you could bring a strategy like this in. Get a whole bunch of postcards for your staff. And every time you have a staff meeting, start with, we're going to give a category and we're going to ask that everybody writes 2 positive postcards to a kid, 2 kids that were in that category, right? Or every Friday, we're going to have our administrative counseling and anybody else who is willing to, we're going to have a list of students who meet a certain criterion, and we're going to try and call as many families as we can in 5 minutes of time. Every call takes a minute or less. And so our categories might be things like 1 week, we are getting our list of all of the students who were on time each day last month. Or we're getting a list of students who in the last term had the most improved attendance from the previous term. Or it's the kids that were regularly attending in the first 6 weeks of school, or the kids that in the last 10 days had perfect attendance in the last 10 days, right? And what I want you to imagine is if we could do these little investments, that positive feedback is also behavioral shaping, right? It's teaching our students and our families that this is something important and something that we value. Okay. In our remaining time together, let's talk a little bit about Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention. What we're trying to do is across time, build a range of different interventions and knowledge of our interventionists for how to intervene with a range of different functions of absenteeism that we might be seeing. So let me give you an example of a highly, highly effective Tier 2 intervention. This was from a middle school in Washington State. And what they did is they created an attendance advisory. Basically, this was a small group intervention. It was for students that were identified as having absenteeism problems the previous term. They were then placed in an advisory class. And this was one of those schools where every student has an advisory that happens 4 days a week. It's a little like 30 or 40-minute mini period where they're doing study skills support. They're teaching some behavioral expectations. They're doing just some fun activities. And most of the students were just randomly placed in different advisories with different teachers. What Keithley did is they created this attendance advisory. So here were the procedures. It was run by counselors. I think that was brilliant, right? Because for some of our students who have attendance issues, there are more complex things going on. And for middle school and high school students, how often do we have kids who need a counselor's support and they don't even know who that counselor is? Right? So we're building an intentional bridge with some of our kids who might be more vulnerable, might need more support with an adult who is trained to try and build that relationship with those kids and try and provide that support. They met every day, Monday through Thursday. Students tracked their attendance daily. So this tracker on the right-hand side of the screen, that's basically the self-monitoring sheet where students would color code green. I was here the whole day yesterday. Yellow, I was here for part of the day. So if a kid skipped a class, if they had an appointment and they were only there for part of the day. Red, I was absent the full day. And then what they were doing is they were tracking the attendance across the course of the week, the month, the term, and it would trigger discussions between the adult and the student. Self-monitoring research has very, very strong support in the behavioral literature. It's kind of the same principle that, like, how many of you are my to-do list people? You write your list, you keep track of it, you cross it off. Self-monitoring is kind of the same thing. They taught lessons about problem solving. So like, a question that they might pose to the students, why are students absent from school? Like, why do you sometimes are absent from school? So if kids are sharing, I slept through my alarm clock, I missed the bus, then we're now problem solving. Like, if that happened, what could you do to try and get to school anyway? How do you prevent yourself from sleeping through your alarm clock? My dad taught me when I went to college, he was such a heavy sleeper. He had to set 2 alarm clocks that were like 30 seconds apart from each other, one that was close to his head to wake him up, and one that was across the room that would force him to get out of bed. So they're doing problem solving with the kids. They also created a peer buddy system. So it was kind of a team system. And when a team member was gone, other students would call and encourage them, try and troubleshoot and problem solve with them. Look at how powerful this is. Each blue bar represents a student's absenteeism before they were in the attendance intervention, and each orange bar, their attendance once they were in the intervention. Remember, our goal is 9 days or less. So that kind of second gray line that you might see there, that's 10 days of absenteeism. What you can see is if we drew a line across at 9 days, every student except for 2 students met the goal, right? So if we're thinking back to that idea of like a filtering analogy, as a tier 2 intervention, this caught a significant proportion of the students that might have been seen as needing additional intervention. But the nice thing is we've now identified kid number 2, and then the kid in the middle. Those are the kids that we're going to need to intervene more heavily as we move forward. This is what effective intervention looks like. So thinking about causes of absenteeism, and in this session, we don't have enough time to go into a whole range of different interventions. I just want to give you a framework for thinking about when you have a student who is absent and we're trying to figure out what is the reason or reasons behind it. This framework, this slide that I'm sharing with you here, is basically like 5 buckets of causes of absenteeism. For some kids, it's 1 cause. For some kids, it's 2 or 3 or 5 of them all together. And obviously there's subcategories. But the first big category is the kid or the family simply just don't understand that attendance is important as it is, or don't understand what the goal is and their attendance in relationship to that goal. This intervention is basically just about awareness building and some self-monitoring to help the student and the family recognize how important this is and where they are during the course of the year. The second big category, these ones are oftentimes a little bit harder to address, but some are easy, some are hard, barriers. So I mentioned before the idea that like if a student can't wash their clothes, that is a barrier to regular attendance. If they don't have regular transportation, that's a barrier. If they are having to watch younger siblings or take care of an ill family member, that's a barrier to attendance, right? Some are easier, some are harder to address, but identifying what those barriers are and then working over time to try and work with a family, work with a kid to overcome them. Part of it is also showing our investment and our deep caring for the student, that like, even if it is a long, ongoing effort to try and figure out solutions, that we are going to be persistent because we care about this kid and we believe in them. Next big category, and actually the third and the fourth kind of go hand in hand. Kid is escaping or avoiding something they find aversive in the school environment, academic failure, chaotic environment, lots of negative interactions with peers or teachers, bullying issues, all examples of escape avoidance. And oftentimes with a competing reinforcer, the kid is finding something more desirable outside of school. So that could be playing video games and computer games. It could be hanging out with other peers who are not in school. It could be seeing mom or dad who works nighttime jobs and the only time I get to see them is if I stay home from school. Again, some easier, some harder to deal with. Last big category is lack of value placed on school. So that's where we see a kid, family, maybe even a community that doesn't feel that school is serving them. Oftentimes it's, you know, history of negative experiences with the school system, or I don't, you know, my vision of success in life in the future doesn't match with what you're talking about with school. Say to yourself the word that I have with an exclamation point capitalized and in parentheses. So lack of value placed on school. I am very, very strongly saying caution. And the reason for that is I find that this tends to be when we are being very judgmental about a kid in a family, when we don't really understand what's going on. And we start to just think, well, they just don't care about school, or they just don't care about their kid's success. More often than not, there's much more complex things going on. And so this category is really about relationship building to try and understand what are the barriers, what are the challenges, and how do we try and come to some sense of collaborative work together to try and help support a child. If you are interested more in the idea of looking at function-based intervention for absenteeism, I do want to mention a resource. We do publish this resource, so full disclosure there, but we actually got our start with this work with absenteeism in partnership with Dr. Bill Jensen, who's the author of the Tough Kid materials. He brought to us sort of the roots of what became this product here, which is a functional behavior assessment of absenteeism and truancy. So it includes observation forums, interviews, records, reviews, et cetera. It's kind of everything that you would need to really dig deep for a student at the tip top of the triangle. This is not a light intervention resource. It's something that is really when you've got a kid that's very resistant absenteeism that we can start to understand what's going on. All right, coming to our closing fast and furious hour that we have here. If you're interested in learning more about the resources and services with Safe and Civil Schools and Ancora Publishing, I'm going to mention a couple of things in just a moment. I also want to do a big plug to Attendance Works. Give me a little like wave or hand motion if you have spent some time looking at their resources. They have fabulous free resource kits. They're always where I go to if I'm looking for like new summaries of the research. So if you're looking for some of the research backing with different grade levels that you work with, I'm seeing Scarlett that you've done some work there. They are a wonderful resource, and we work very closely in partnerships conceptually with Attendance Works. Now, just a couple of things to mention. We do have some fall and winter virtual courses coming up, and the one that I want to highlight, if you look in the middle of your screen there, I am going to be leading basically an 18-hour distributed course, largely for administrators, counselors, social workers, district folks, building folks that are in that work of trying to think about your system. Teachers, of course, are welcome, but it is occurring during the school day, so it may be harder for some of you. I've got the dates listed on the screen, and they're basically going to be 3-hour sessions on Mondays. I believe we're starting in the morning Pacific Coast time, so it'll be like midday for those of you on the East Coast. If you'd like more details on that, you can go to the Safe and Civil Schools website. You can also use the QR code that's here. I'll make sure that I send this out as well. That course is going to basically be about 9 hours on the universal system portion of this, the prevention portions, and about 9 hours on function-based interventions and developing a range of interventions in your school. I also want to highlight that we are starting to make this webinar series a monthly thing. And so our next one that's coming up is on August 4th, is really designed for teachers and anyone who supports teachers with classroom management. So it's going to be kind of highlighting some of the critical classroom management practices, especially needed right for the launch of school, and helping people think about, you know, on day one, when my kids come in, how do we start things off to a real strong start? I also have listed here the webinars that we'll have coming up with the dates. And again, there's a QR code here, and we'll send out information about this as well. So thank you all so much for your time today. I hope it's given you some things to think about. It's really just the tip of the iceberg of all of the different strategies that you know, we've seen schools implementing to address this. I hope that you all, obviously, if you were here live, like you were invested in this, you know, it's important. How do you start lighting that fire for everybody else that you work with? The multi-tiered model we have found is really highly effective for all sorts of different things in schools, and attendance is no exception. So that focus on universal prevention, the focus on function-based layered intervention for tier 2 and tier 3. And my hope is that you all are seeing my belief, my deep-seated belief, because I've seen it in action, that change of mindset. This is something that we can make a difference with. It is, just like anything else, requires some time, effort, and energy, but trying to do it in that layered approach makes it much more manageable. And please let me know if you have any questions or would ever like to consider partnership with Safe and Civil in this great work. So thank you all so much for your time. I am happy to stay on if any of you have questions, but I am going to stop the recording here. And feel free to exit if you don't have any questions. Thank you all.